Historically, Palestine, I'm not a historian, but historically Palestine kind of evolved, the concept evolved in the Roman times with the Jordan River running through the middle. You had a Western Palestine, Eastern Palestine. You pick up any history book about the Middle East, you'll see that there's a West Palestine and an East Palestine. So right now, Eastern Palestine is occupied by Jordan, run by Jordan. So what will happen someday? The majority of people who live in Jordan are Palestinians, refugees, whatever they're called, they're Palestinians. What will happen someday when they realize that that's also a Palestinian state? Will there be two Palestinian states, or will there only be one? What will the borders be? How do you visualize that?
Thank you, Kurt.
So it's a great question. Historically, you're accurate in terms of thinking about what the territory of Palestine looked like under the Ottoman Empire. But a lot has changed after nationalism. So what was then understood to be Palestine is not necessarily going to be how the borders are drawn today. I can't give you an answer about what I imagine it looking like, but I can tell you the possibilities that people have put forth. One is that we know historically that Jordan doesn't have any desire to become a Palestinian state, and we saw that with Black September in 1970, with the massacre of Palestinians by the Jordanians. So Jordan is going to retain its Jordanian national identity, and its identity is based upon having a king who controls that society, who's desperately holding on to power, not because he's concerned about Palestinian takeover, but because he's concerned about ISIL and ISIS. A future Palestinian state, if it is to emerge, has to take place in two places. Whatever will become of Gaza, which Egypt does not want, and whatever will become of the West Bank, which Israel is struggling to figure out what parts it wants and what parts it doesn't want. There are all of these crazy ideas of how you could create a contiguous Palestinian state. There are talks about creating a land bridge, literally a piece of land that bridges between Gaza and the West Bank. There's also discussions about maybe you do have three states, but actually Jordan isn't part of that three-state conversation. It's Gaza as a state, Hamasistan, Israel, and Fatah land. That's what the West Bank is. And so what will be of a Palestinian state when you have Fatah controlling the West Bank and Hamas controlling Gaza? And are these entities able at all to be unified at any point in time? There's a real question mark around that. We don't have the answer to that. And I will tell you that the majority of negotiators do not know the answer to that. Part of the challenge for negotiators, people like David Makovsky and Dennis Ross and Elliot Abrams and all of these brilliant minds, is that as negotiators, they have to be concerned about where you draw the border and whether those borders will be recognized. What they don't have to do is what historians think about, identities. They don't think about narratives. They don't deal with narratives. If you deal with a narrative, it's very complicated to come to any type of probable solution. So this is part of the challenge. So I'm giving you a very unsatisfactory answer, knowing that there really isn't one that has been thought of to suffice for all parties. Because of Gaza and its Hamas control, because the leadership of Fatah is extremely low, Khalil Shikaki, who is a Palestinian pollster from Birzeit University, who also happens to teach at Brandeis University in the spring, will tell you that the recent polls from the West Bank, that's where he's focused, does not show full support of the Palestinian Authority anymore. That you have an increasing younger generation who supports Hamas. Now, it's not because they like Islamism. They're secularists. So why do they support Hamas? Because they hate Fatah. Because they don't trust Abu Mazen, and because they don't trust any future Palestinian leadership coming out of that entity. So the majority of Palestinians, he told me it was, something like 40% of Palestinians living in the West Bank from the younger generation support Hamas. He said, but don't worry, the majority still support Fatah. Well, that's a very close set of numbers. And it doesn't take much to tip it. And the rising age is coming from that younger generation. You have a huge demographic boom from that generation that is not at all yet in a position of leadership, but is slowly moving in that direction. So this is a challenge. The Palestinians have not figured out from the Palestinian Authority how to think through that challenge. And those Palestinians living under Hamas control, let's be very clear, the majority of them also do not want Hamas in control anymore. It's that when they voted for Hamas, it was a vote in protest of the Palestinian Authority, because at the time, the Palestinian Authority was not providing infrastructure. They were not picking up the trash. They were not giving those Palestinians living in Gaza an educational system. And so Hamas was providing some of those social service welfare projects, which is how they got the vote. So this is a very complicated issue, but Jordan is not going to go anywhere in my mind, because Jordan is very much Jordan today. So you're talking about the slim territory of the West Bank, the territory of Gaza, and everyone is concerned about the influence of Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, and Syria. And of course, the Russian influence in all of this does not help.
Thank you. Okay, Jack.
Hi, thank you very much for your comments, especially breaking it down into 4 different areas. We look forward to your talks here at Adult Ed in the springtime. Question I have, and I've raised this sometimes here, is how do we help our children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren who are finishing high school and about to go off to college, and too often they're not just somewhat little left-wing professors, but Marxist professors pushing the BDS movement to help our kids be able to really confront them and discuss things properly in educational stand with them.
Thank you, Jack.
So it's a real challenge. I mean, even Tufts University this past fall, for those of you who were paying attention, saw that a professor who's a more junior person, I'm not sure if the person has tenure or not, decided to have a class entitled Israel's Settler Colonialist State, right? And this is for credit. So it's very challenging for an 18, 19, 20-year-old to challenge the basis of that professor's position. And very often you will have students who say, well, I knew what I would be getting into and I didn't want to get into that, so I decided not to take that course. And this is when it's very important that there's strong relationships with the university administration and the provost, so that other faculty can actually try to influence what kind of courses are being taught. And that does not mean a pro-Israel course by any means. That's not what I'm suggesting, but I'm suggesting an academically sound course. And Brandeis University at the Schusterman Center for years has been training academicians in all different fields so that they can have the ability to be able to teach about Israel, whether in comparative literature, international relations, history, whatever it is, and have the foundation to ask the state of the questions in the field of Israel studies. And Israel studies is different than Israel education. Israel studies in the academic setting is not about identity education. Right? When I'm teaching my students in university, I don't care if they're Zionists. It doesn't matter. They should never know that I'm a Zionist. They don't need to know how I vote. They don't need to know my politics. If they know that, I actually have done a disservice, because I should be engaging in the classroom in a manner of Wissenschaft des Judentums, the objective scientific study of Judaism, right? In this case, Israel. That's the ideal. That's the aspiration. That's what I aspire to. I can tell you there are many faculty in the humanities who have the complete hafuch, it's upside down, desire. And it doesn't only extend to Israel, right? I've had faculty members who walk into class and say, my name is so-and-so, this is the first day of class, I am a lesbian activist academic. I don't care, right? Like, I don't care. It's not what you're doing in the classroom. But it shows you the prism or the lens through which they are going to be engaging the academic material. So this is a concern that's not only about Israel. I would say this is a concern about larger questions of Western civilization. And I would also argue that, yes, some of it is Marxism, and there are other intellectual influences as well. And I've said some of those in this hall before, right? It's about globalization and the idea that the nation state has died, which is not true, but that's the articulation. It's the idea of postmodernism, which has some relevant and important ideas, but it also says that there's no objective truth and that there are no historical facts. So it creates moral relativism. It's the influence of Marxism in the sense of power relations, right? So it's not about economics. It's about the goal is to weaken the strong and strengthen the weak. And in that scenario, if you impose it on Israel, Israel is the strong, so it ought to be weakened. And the Palestinians ought to be strengthened. It's the idea of therapy, right? Sensitivity trumps facts, period. So for any other group, it's about making sure that you're sensitive to them rather than thinking about the facts. And it's also notions that Jews are not part of a vulnerable minority, but rather part of the white majority. And that plays out on the college campus. And the college campus actually is an inverse understanding of the power or hierarchy of power that you see playing out in the real world. So intersectionality, a term that many of you may be familiar with, do any of you know intersectionality? Intersectionality is a concept that was articulated in the 1980s by a professor named Kimberly Crenshaw. And the idea of intersectionality that she articulated was that there's an intersection between different identities. So if you're a woman, and if you're black, and if you're, pick another identity, there are ways in which some of those overlap, and so you should be able to create greater allies in your movement. Well, we saw this play out, for example, in the feminist movement in the 1960s, in which women, Jewish women, were excluded from the feminist movement, right? Intersectionality didn't work to the Jewish cause. On college campus today, intersectionality is a huge buzzword, and you have many different groups who come together in order to frame their identity politics. But the problem is that the more you can show your victimization, the more power you have on college campus. In that equation, Jews will always lose. Always. Partly because of skin color, partly because the majority of Jewish students do not see themselves as victims, which they shouldn't, right? Partly because Jews have been taught for a long time, if I am not for myself, who am I? And if I am only for myself, who will I be? But they forgot that it's not only about the particularism piece, and they're only hyper-focused on the universalist piece. So they have forgotten what it means to be for the Jewish cause. This is part of the challenge that Jews are facing on college campus. The other piece is that on college campus, when anti-Semitism emerges, when it comes from the hard left, it's hard for Jews, the Jewish students specifically, to understand that they see it and they feel it, and that sniff test is not so easily passed, whereas when it comes from the hard right, it's much easier, because when a swastika is drawn on a campus quad, the majority of students, no matter who they are, can get out there and erase it. But when it comes from someone saying that Israel has no right to exist, they're not sure if that's about political discourse and academic freedom, or if it's a form of anti-Semitism. And when it's your professor who controls your grades, and Jewish students like to study and get good grades, it concerns them about the impact that individual may have on their future. So all of these are real issues. It requires, I would argue, much more than education, but it requires all of us in this room. It requires all of the teachers that our students encounter, and it requires religious leadership that our students engage with to have moral courage, and to teach them that moral courage, and to teach them that they have to stand up anytime anti-Semitism rears its head, left, right, center. Because Jews don't fare well in either of those situations. There are different institutions that are now set up. The Israel Coalition on Campus is an institution under the rubric of Hillel International, which is in some ways an intelligence task force to help students deal with those issues. There are many Hillels that are good on this issue. There are many Hillels who are not good on this issue. There are faculty, and there are faculty resources, the Academic Engagement Network, which has become a very important faculty organ of the faculty to be able to come together and think about how do you deal with BDS issues. And we see BDS is not dying. I can tell you that BDS is not having an impact on Israel in terms of economic issues at all. But BDS has a real impact in the North American context on our students' identity issues. Because the majority of young people, unless they're firmly entrenched in wanting to deal with these issues, the majority are in that vast middle who say, I just want to go to school, I just want to have fun, I want to hang out with my friends, I want to go to football games, I don't want to fight. I don't want to fight. And if you really care about this stuff, eventually you're going to have to fight. There's just no way around it. So it is a challenge. But again, to me, and maybe this is because of growing up in a small town, it's part of who we're supposed to be, right? It's a privilege to be part of this community, but we also have a responsibility. And so this is part of our responsibility.
Well said, thank you. And for those who might be startled, that protester in the back is not a protester from the, if not now, that's Sam Berg. Nice to have someone under 18 here. Okay, and now for our chair for our adult ed, who's going to bring Rachel back a second time, Bert Mama.
Okay. Thank you, Dewey. I just wanted to mention that, first of all, you certainly brought out the many tensions and challenges that there are in Israel, as well as here. We have so many tensions and challenges here in the States. But the subject that you're going to be bringing back to us and going into detail, which is Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, or is it, will be more on the tensions around particularism and, as you mentioned, universalism that goes in there. But these are serious tensions, and I don't know if we can cover it all during our classes, but I just want to mention to everyone here that you have an opportunity to hear Dr. Rachel Fish discuss these subjects and for you to get into the details of those, and I'll let it go with that. Thank you so much for being here.
Okay, and Rachel, before you answer, I'm going to have one more question thrown out here by Debbie DeBarton from Temple Emmanuel from the Israel Action Committee. And then you can address a little bit of each, because we're at the very end where we must leave because of the funeral.
Thank you so much. This is amazing. You answered some of my question in the previous question, but I was, in your discussion of teaching the rigor of the Palestinian perspective, the Israeli perspective, and understand that sometimes that morphs into anti-Israelism, anti-Zionism, which goes to anti-Semitism. So I was wondering if you could comment on that. That conversation is in the high school, college, it's in our communities, how that switches, that understanding the differences just switches to the far, far left, which is anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism.
Yeah,
And just so you're aware, we have like 8 minutes.
Yep, so I don't actually think it has to, right? If you're a serious educator, I should be able to explain the challenges of liberal capitalism, right? And I should also be able to explain socialism without anyone feeling as if I'm trying to put them into a particular economic agenda, right? I should be able to do that. Just like I should be able, when I'm talking about relations between Arabs and Israelis, be able to show the complexity and the discourse and the multiplicity of perspectives. And it's only when I think you already have a presupposed advocacy position that you want to articulate and put forth that you wind up veering into that area. Because in my classroom, we read all of the documents. Right? We read about Palestinian voices. We bring those voices in. We understand the future vision documents I mentioned, which in comparison to Ruth Govison's documents. That doesn't mean I have a clear political goal at all. It means I want them to understand the cacophony of voices that are in this discourse and the complexity around it. And I think that C word, complexity, is one of the most important components because our students and many of the educators are using classrooms in order to say there's a black and white position and they don't help their students live in that gray mud. The gray mud is where you learn and educate and engage and know that you should be leaving the classroom with more question marks at the end of your sentences rather than exclamation points. And if students aren't doing that, that means the educator did not do a good job, right, teaching some of this foundational material. As I said, in an academic setting, my goal is not to have a student walk out and say, I'm a Zionist. If they want to come in my office and have a private conversation about their Zionist theories, fine. That's different. And I don't grade a student on whether or not they accept a Zionist position. That is academically dishonest. But again, it means that you have to have people who understand how do you bring in multiple narratives in order to engage in the questions. The question of, for example, is there Palestinian nationalism? My answer is of course yes. And I can show you historical documents that will show you that will take you there. You can talk about the influences of Palestinian nationalism, one of which of course is Zionism. That does not mean I then become an anti-Israel educator. So we have to be very careful about how we judge as outsiders what happens in the classroom. We have to look at what's being read, who's writing that material, what are the assignments. If I have a teacher, and this happened, who said, you know, my classroom assignment for my final exam was, does Israel have a right to exist? Well, I have a problem with that final assignment because no one would ever say, does North Korea have a right to exist? Does China have a right to exist? That is not the starting point for an academically sound question. So just because multiple perspectives are being brought in doesn't mean you will automatically become an anti-Israel position. I do think who does it and how it's done matters, but I'm very wary as an academic of being judged at all from outsiders to say, well, because you brought in the voice of Rashid Khalidi or Sari Nusseibeh, you have a political agenda. Not true. But if you don't know those voices, it's not also fully comprehensive. So this is the challenge, and it's like any other subject area, right? Again, growing up in the South, do you teach about evolution or not? Well, I hope so, but not always, right? And there was a court case to talk about why this is a problem. So this is what academics have to work with and struggle with, but I will tell you, this is why many academicians don't want to teach the subject. It's also why Middle East studies has become grievance studies. And Middle East studies is only about, in many cases, an anti-Israel agenda, right? And Israel is excluded from the topic. I also want to tell you that in many Jewish studies, Israel studies is also excluded because it's very complicated to talk about this place today and what it means for Jews to hold power. And it's a lot easier to talk about the Holocaust or Yiddish literature or the sociology of the American Jewish community, right? So it's complicated. Thank you.